I'm clicking the record button. So welcome and thank you so much for coming today to talk about a very important, timely issue, which is the question of social and racial justice in America. So before we start, so let's take a minute and just set our motivation for engaging in Dharma practice. Thinking how incredibly fortunate we are to have had the opportunity to learn about the Buddha Dharma and to take full responsibility for really putting what we've learned into practice. So not just leaving the Buddha Dharma teachings, coming to class and listening, maybe doing a little glance meditation when we have a few minutes of free time, but not really putting the teachings, into practice. So let's make the resolution, for this new year, which is still quite new. Let's make that our New Year resolution. So I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly by my practice of giving and all other perfections. May I become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay. So I hope this discussion today about social and racial justice inspires you as individuals and perhaps as DNKL as a community to explore these topics in greater detail in the future. So this is just, an introduction. I'm not offering, solutions or really action items so much, but just asking questions and maybe laying the groundwork for future exploration. So the talk has 3 sections. The first part introduces the topic of social and racial justice by providing some basic facts about the situation in the United States. Part 2 then briefly explains how to meditate on the Buddha's teachings on love and compassion as a means of shedding light on issues of equality and justice at a very granular level. And then part 3 looks at the role that Western Dharma centers, such as DNKL, have played and can play in helping those who are targets of social injustice. So as a second-generation Asian American growing up in New York City, I've experienced some degree of racism all of my life. And lately, due to the political hate mongering that has blamed China for COVID-19, attacks on Asians have increased. I'm sure you've heard of this if you've been, paying attention to the news. An 84-year-old man from Thailand and a 91-year-old woman in separate incidents, were both knocked to the ground and killed. This was in Oakland, California, a few weeks ago. And in many cases, these people who are victims are not even Chinese. They just look Asian, right? So there's been a rise in the harassment of Asians, on the subway, in their homes, in public places, everywhere across the country. So that's brought back, memories of when I was growing up. Nothing like that. Nobody physically attacked me, but certainly insults, were not uncommon. And again, racism struck close to home for me when one of my white neighbors put a Black Lives Matter sign on his front lawn as an expression of solidarity after the police shooting of George Floyd. And sadly, another neighbor was seen knocking down the sign and then ramming into this guy's mailbox with his pickup truck late at night. So it's painfully clear that instead of uniting our country against a common threat, COVID has deepened the cracks in American society, exposing inequities in all dimensions of life, from housing, education, employment, access to healthcare, including the vaccine, and rubbing raw the mistrust and fear of minorities, for lack of a better word. Sometimes I'm just going to use the word minorities. But what's important to point out is that when one sector of our society is attacked and treated unjustly, we all suffer, right? I think we all feel that to some degree. So just a quick overview of some of these inequities. So in terms of housing, approximately 50% of the homeless population is Black, and yet Blacks comprise only 13% of the US population. In terms of COVID-19's effect on minority populations, actually, it's the American Indians who have suffered the most. So the number of cases, this was as of the end of, very recently, from the CDC website. This is from the beginning of February 12th. The number of cases of American Indians who have become ill is 1.9 times the number of white Americans. And then for hospitalization, 3.7 times the rate, and death 2.4 times the rate. So that was American Indians. And then for Blacks, the hospitalization rate is 2.9 times, and the death rate was 1.9 times. Hospitalizations for Hispanics was 3.2 times the rate for white Americans. So in a recent New York Times article, Racism's Hidden Toll, the authors say that, in America, how long you live, your very lifespan, your health, your lifespan, depends on the color of your skin. So that's a really big finding. In terms of incarcerations in 2018, the incarceration rate of Blacks was nearly twice the rate of Hispanics, and more than 5 times the rate among whites. In Black men in particular, the rate was 2,272 inmates per 100,000, compared with 392 per 100,000 of white men. In particular, between the ages of 35 and 39, 1 in 20 Black men were in state or federal prison. These high incarceration rates have profound social and economic effects on families and the local communities. So let's take a step back and talk about what do we mean by the word justice. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama notes 2 different aspects of justice. So justice can be a general principle, meaning in a universal precept of fairness and redress based on the recognition of human equality. It also, the second aspect is the narrower understanding of justice as the exercise of law within whatever legal framework we're talking about. So ideally, these 2 principles should go hand in hand seamlessly, but they often don't, right? So if a group holding power uses that power against another religious or political group that it feels counters its interests, then if in the name of justice, right? So then that's not genuine justice. That's justice has to be applied equally in order to truly be justice. Otherwise, it's just a ruse. So lately, this idea of justice has been subdivided into social justice, racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice. But no matter how you slice or dice it, those who bear the brunt of injustice are the weak, the poor, the invisible members of our society. We must also think of women who experience gender bias. There's age discrimination, as well as persons with disabilities, the mentally ill, and the LGBTQ community. And more, these are just the tip of the iceberg, right? Everybody who's confronted with intolerance. So our country has experienced the fire of hatred firsthand and seen the devastation and anarchy that it creates. Racist rhetoric from political leaders has encouraged bigotry and lawlessness. Racially biased police shootings of Blacks sparked violent protests that erupted in cities across the United States, causing widespread damage to communities, both in terms of economic losses, but also destroyed relationships. So what gave rise to these violent protests? We really have to ask ourselves. We can't just, look at the news and say, why are they so angry, right? No, we have to really dig down and try to understand the origin of that anger. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, we need to look to history to understand the racial inequality in our criminal justice system. So I think this is really important to spend some time thinking about, because I think it's an aspect of history that we're not exposed to. So the Equal Justice Initiative has documented over 4,000 racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1950, right? 1950 wasn't that long ago. And more than 300 racial terror lynchings in other states during the same time period. So lynching shaped the geographic, political, social, and economic conditions that African Americans still experience today. And how is that? So critically, racial terror lynchings reinforce the belief that Black people are inherently guilty and dangerous. So that, tradition of lynching, has carried through today in terms of perception of Blacks, but, also in terms of how the police, think of them. So mass incarceration, racially biased capital punishment, excessive and disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, police abuse of people of color. So these all reveal problems in American society that was shaped by this history. So Brian Stevenson was the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the author of a really, really phenomenal book called Just Mercy. This should be on everybody's reading list. He writes, constantly being suspected, accused, watched, doubted, distrusted, presumed guilty, and even feared as a burden borne by people of color that can't be understood or confronted without a deeper conversation about our history of racial justice. So Black people were 28% of those killed by police in 2020, despite being only 13% of the population. So they're 3 times more likely to be killed than whites. They're 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed than whites. So to give a sense of the numbers, so over 1,000 people were killed by police in 2020. Police as a whole, the population as a whole, over 1,000 people were killed by police. So how is racism so embedded in American society that we often fail to recognize our unconscious biases? So this gets a little bit at this idea of, what can we do to address racism ourselves on a personal level? So pervasive biases mostly go unnoticed. And Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a professor of psychology at Stanford University, in her groundbreaking book called Biased, another must-read book, is filled with detailed research studies documenting our biases, our stereotypes, our prejudices, and how they control the way we see ourselves and others. Eberhardt herself is Black, and she shares a poignant example of her 5-year-old son who, when they were on a plane, noticed a lone Black male passenger who was sitting in the row, across from him. And he asked his mother quietly if that man was going to rob everybody on the plane. So stereotyping and prejudice, what does that mean? It means you only see an image in your head instead of reality. So before they ever even enter kindergarten, Black children are already considered more likely to misbehave than white children by their teachers. And this bias continues through their education and on into adulthood. So imagine growing up and asking yourself, do I matter? Am I to be feared? Like that small child. Should I live in fear? Am I human? There's a profound identity crisis in all our Black and brown students and others. So the tragedy is that white supremacy has been internalized by minorities. And Lama Rod Owens, who is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and he's Black and gay, for example, admits that he finds white bodies more aesthetically pleasing, that he's embarrassed when Blacks protest angrily in public spaces, and experiences fear when he encounters Black men. And he says this very honestly in a collection of essays called Radical Dharma. with a sense of, despair that he has been, so almost like brainwashed into believing these things. So we should ask ourselves to what extent our identity is shaped by how others categorize us, stereotype us, and how much control do we have over our own over how we are seen, and even our own sense of self-worth. So Larry Yang, who is an Asian American man who's gay, and he's a well-known Buddhist teacher, particularly I think on the West Coast. He helped to co-found the East Bay Meditation Center. He said some of the questions that he's asked himself are, how would I succeed in a mainstream culture that makes things really, really difficult, even oppressive for those who appear different? Where is it that I can feel that I truly belong? How can I be who I am while simultaneously trying to fit in? Do I differentiate even further to stand out, to be different? Or do I even try to be like better than the them of the dominant culture? Jennifer Eberhardt references a study that shows that in the job market, applicants with Black sounding names were 50% less likely to get a callback than applicants with white sounding names. And highly qualified Black applicants were less likely to be called back than less qualified whites. A team of researchers asked Black and Asian college students who were job hunting if they thought racial bias would hold them back, and they said yes. They were very aware of this and very honest. So many had scrubbed their names of references that could draw attention to their race that might trigger damaging stereotypes, including anglicizing their names, like maybe using a nickname instead of their real name, and toning down or omitting ethnic affiliations. So like maybe they've been the president of the Black Students Association. Well, they just didn't put it on the resume, right? Or like a Korean action activist community group. They just didn't put it on the resume. Some even added activities typically associated with whites, like kayaking or hiking. The point is that the students felt the need to conform to white majority expectations. And this kind of suppressing or twisting your identity to try to meet somebody else's expectations in order to gain access to privileges, right? Like getting into a good school, is a kind of trauma, right? I mean, you really torture yourself to have to twist and stretch and pull yourself apart like silly putty. So other examples, quick examples, recently, not too long ago, actually maybe it was a year or two ago, you might have heard of that case at Starbucks, where two young Black men were waiting for a white business partner to arrive. They were going to have a meeting. And so they didn't order anything because they were waiting for their client to show up. And the manager had called the police and asked them to be removed. And the pretext was they hadn't ordered anything. So anybody who's ever gone to Starbucks knows that, not 95% of the people who go to Starbucks never order anything. They just sit there and, they're on their computers or their phones, right? So this is an obvious case of bias. And Starbucks, actually, to its credit, then closed all of their stores across every location and asked everybody, all of their employees, to participate in diversity training. Another example that Jennifer Eberhardt mentions is she describes the experience of a Black nurse who was frequently assumed to be the janitor, at work. Whereas, her white colleague, much to her embarrassment, who is actually like the nurse's assistant, the nurse's aide, so lower in status, was always assumed to be the nurse. On a personal level, a long time ago when I was a kid, I went to a birthday party at one of my friend's homes, and her apartment happened to be on, Park Avenue in New York City, in a very exclusive location, right? So my dad came from after work, to pick me up. And he said, where's the elevator? And the doorman, without thinking, twice, pointed to the service elevator instead of the regular, elevator. So my dad was I think it was a mixture of being offended and, kind of amused. But then I was at the shoe store in New York City the other day to exchange a pair of shoes. And there were two employees who were trying to resolve a problem with the return. And one was, black and one was white. And I realized that without even thinking about it, my unconscious bias assumed that the white person was the manager and the black person was not, was just, and as it turns out, I was completely wrong. So, it's terrible. We have these implicit biases and we're just not cognizant of them most of the time. So we really have to work on that, right? Really watch our minds for any tendency to do that and catch ourselves. So what can we do to promote unity and equality and foster healing? And in the context of this talk, this is particularly, trying to bring this home back to the Dharma, the teachings. So first of all, let's be honest, right? We need to do the hard work of uncovering our biases. And Jennifer Eberhardt asks, in what ways do we focus on the biases of others as a defensive strategy, right? It's easy to just say, oh, well, everybody else is biased, but I'm not, right? So that doesn't work, right? We have to start with our own minds, our own hearts. Let's not, finger point and say, oh, there's no bias, right? And not do the hard work of looking at our own implicit bias, because they're there. They're definitely there. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist master, in his book, Living Buddha, Living Christ, another must read, explains that even if we don't physically kill someone, we should be aware that we kill others with our minds all the time. A moment of violence, whether it's mental or physical, sows the seeds, millions and millions of seeds of hatred that can then be passed down generation after generation after generation, right? So can we look within ourselves and acknowledge our own brokenness, our own vulnerability, our own need to heal from whatever trauma? We've all experienced trauma of some kind, right? How can we use these experiences as the core of our spiritual path and see that we're not alone? Use that suffering as a way of opening our hearts to others, right? Using that as a bridge. So Lama Owens writes in Radical Dharma, healing means we're holding the space for our woundedness and allowing it to open our hearts to the reality that we are not the only people who are hurt, lonely, angry, or frustrated. We must also release the habitual aggression that characterizes our avoidance of trauma or any discomfort. He talks about the importance of not turning away from suffering and instead to bear witness to others' suffering as our own. And that's really, at the heart of the Buddha's teachings, right? We talk all about, well, I'll get to that, in greater detail later, but hold that thought, right? The first noble truth was the truth of suffering, and there was a reason for that, right? We're not talking about suffering like, oh, should I have steak for dinner? Oh, it's too bad that we don't have salmon. I'd really rather have salmon, right? We're talking on a whole nother level of magnitude here. Recognizing our own hurt and suffering leads us to relentlessly search for the source of our pain, right? This is what it's all about. We come to the realization that our enemies are not external, but rather internal, right? So what did Shantideva say? Shantideva taught us that as long as we believe that enemies are external, we can defeat army after army, but there will always be more and more. On the other hand, by defeating the true enemy, who is our narrow self-cherishing, then that's what makes our enemies, our external enemies, disappear forever. So Thich Nhat Hanh explains that embodying the spirit, of loving your enemies, that's what makes enemies disappear immediately and forever, ever, because when you look deeply into your own anger, you see that the person who you consider an enemy is suffering, right? And so the capacity of accepting her and having compassion for her is always there. Always there. So whether we're Buddhist or maybe we come from a Christian background, whatever religious tradition, the focus of our spiritual paths, is very, very similar. It's to develop genuine love and compassion, not just for our friends and family, but for all beings. The teachings, as I said earlier in the beginning, should not just be locked away in books and, considered precious, but something that is kind of abstract, right? Instead, we need to fulfill their purpose. We need to live and embody the teachings. We really need to bring them to life. Otherwise, they're meaningless. How can we do this? We need to open our hearts, especially to those who are in need, offering a place of refuge, taking the time to understand where people are coming from. All these ways are ways of engaging in virtue, right? That's what the Buddha taught, engaging in virtue. We need to collect merit. What does that mean? Okay, well, here's some very concrete ways. We can't expect the world to change if we're unwilling to do the inner work of self-discovery, of confronting our biases and taming our negative emotions, hatred, attachment, ignorance, greed, pride, jealousy, and the like, right? So we all have the potential to be enlightened, and our spiritual aspirations will only be fulfilled if we can recognize our shared humanity, our inherent inseparability. So our goal then is to live together collectively, harmoniously, right, in a way that embodies non-harm, non-oppression, and non-exclusion. We're trying to build communities that are based on these principles. Communities, and then a society, and then a nation as a whole, based on those very principles. So we must create peace in the world from a peacefulness. The starting place is going to be a peacefulness, emotional stability, openness, love, and compassion that resides, in ourselves. We can't create world peace from a place of violence in our own hearts. So you may have, you may be very familiar with the prayer, the 4 Immeasurables. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings be may all beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. As we've seen from the perspective of many African Americans, external suffering often takes the form of low income, homelessness, discrimination, violence, and abuse, hatred, distrust of the police and hospitals, those organizations, those agencies who should be, protecting them, but instead they feel great distrust of them based on their historical experiences with them. In terms of their mental health or their internal suffering, they're very prone to suffering depression and chronic stress. The chronic stress and the fear arise from, being accused of a crime you didn't commit, of being shadowed, when you walk through a department store, or being randomly arrested on the street when you're just out for a walk. They may have low self-interest due to internalizing white supremacist messaging. They may think they're less than. So bullying is another type of suffering that many of us have experienced, with race and religion being the two top reasons. But when you think of, adolescents, kids in middle school, high school, kids can get teased for anything from, having a big nose, too many pimples, or a funny sounding name. And about 20% of students between the ages of 12 and 18 experienced bullying nationwide. I think that was a 2020 statistic, with 15% being cyberbullying and the rest being, in person at school. So if we meditate on love and compassion, the joy of liberation and equanimity on the cushion, but then we get up, and go out into the world and we act in a biased, harmful way, if we feel jealous for those who have more than us, or superior and condescending to those who have less, this is hypocritical and non-virtuous and will only lead to suffering in this life and in the future. So Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche has been elaborating, on that theme, repeating that theme, revisiting that theme over and over again in his teachings. He's giving a series of teachings on Shantideva's A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. We pray for all sentient beings to be happy and free from suffering. Well, if that's the case, we need to be very, very careful not to do the opposite, right? We need to be very careful not to rejoice in their suffering. And oftentimes we do this without even realizing it. Khyentse Rinpoche also pointed this out, right? Don't rejoice, in the suffering of people who maybe don't look like us, if they come from different cultural backgrounds, especially if they've harmed us in any way, etc. To give kind of like a high level example, for example, if a prisoner on death row is executed, do we rejoice that justice was served? Trump ordered 13 death row inmates to be executed between the months of July and January. No president in more than 120 years had ever overseen as many federal executions. Do the victims' families, feel happy? Often they don't, and they don't feel a sense of closure. They only feel sorrow. So maybe we're not all that interested in the hardships that those experiencing social injustice face in the United States. Maybe because we don't, know anybody personally. We're ambivalent, or we're busy with our own problems, and maybe we just don't care. But we should not turn a blind eye to those people among us who are experiencing this kind of intolerance, because that's a form of abandoning sentient beings. The sentient beings who we may have, neutral feeling towards, right? But if we're striving to attain Buddhahood, we can't abandon a single sentient being. As Mahayana practitioners, we're working for all beings, right? Not just our individual liberation. We seek to develop collective forms of awareness, right? So Larry Yang in his book, Awakening, says, we can't attain Buddhahood without opening our hearts to all beings, not just our friends and loved ones. This means embracing the diverse experience of all beings, right? If we exclude just a single individual from our bodhicitta, then we're transgressing our bodhisattva vow. So when you talk about the diverse experience of all beings, so that means, taking the time, as I said earlier, to really try to understand where people are coming from, not being too quick to judge people, by their actions, but really understanding the source of that pain, the source of that suffering. The last line of the prayer, going back to that, may all beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Let's look at that, what attachment means, okay? So the last line of the prayer focuses on developing immeasurable equanimity. We renounce attachment for friends and family because, as the Lam Rim explains, our attachment to them can only cause us to engage in non-virtue, often causes us to engage in non-virtue for their sake. Not all the time, but it can cause us to engage in non-virtue for their sake. And due to the law of karmic cause and effect, non-virtue can only end in suffering. At the time of death, our loved ones are of no benefit to us, and we have to leave them behind, even though we may have lied or stolen or killed them over and over again. At the time of death, they're of no benefit to us. So to give another example, recent example, have you ever heard of Lady Gaga? I guess everybody knows Lady Gaga. She's a famous pop star, apparently. And her dog walker was a young man whose name is Gary Fisher. He was out walking her 3 French bulldogs. In broad daylight, 2 men jumped out of a white van and demanded the dogs at gunpoint. So he refused. And after shooting him, the shooters left with 2 of the dogs. And he was found, lying on the sidewalk, having been shot, cradling that 3rd bulldog. So this was a flight or fight decision, whether or not to protect the dogs. And so the attachment of, was there. The attachment to not give up the dogs, to try to save their lives, was at the root. There was no time to think, it's a virtuous act to save the dogs. It would be non-virtuous to hand them over. So he's a real hero for being willing to try to save the dogs, right? And well, let's take. But what if he'd been armed, right? What if he had been carrying, a gun? Would he have shot back in self-defense to protect the dogs? So that, if he had shot the shooters, the attackers, right, then that would be non-virtue, because he would have been trying to harm them, according to the Buddha's teachings, and that's an act of harm. So there's this famous story about from the Buddha's life, previous life. So at one point he was the captain of a ship. I'm sure you've heard the story. And on the ship that had, let's say 100 passengers, there was one mass murderer. And this murderer, was intent on killing everybody on the ship. So Buddha, in order to prevent the killer from carrying out that heinous, crime, he killed the murderer, this evildoer, this guy who had evil intent, right? So Buddha, in that case, his motivation was not to protect, himself. It was to prevent the murderer, would-be murderer, right, from killing the passengers, because the result would have been for him to be reborn in the hell realms, right? So Buddha was actually saving this would-be killer from being reborn in hell. And Buddha knew that he himself, because he had killed the murderer, or was about to kill the murderer, that he himself would experience the karma of being reborn in hell, right? So, so we have to, think about the way karma works very carefully, and it's tricky for us to think about this reasoning and to apply it very purely to our actions, right? Because we are always, unlike Buddha, we are always caught up, in defending ourselves and protecting ourselves and our loved ones. So the way we think of ourselves, our identity, our sense of who we are is defined by many kinds of subtle attachment. So those who experience disparities in treatment based on gender, age, physical abilities, economic or educational status, a history of trauma or abuse, they feel marginalized and isolated. And over time, we can internalize, this sense of self-hatred, self-blame, a sense of being less than. We set limits for ourselves, like we have our own internal glass ceiling of what we can achieve based on what others think of us. And in a way, we become attached to the suffering of self-hatred. Like, it's so part of us, so ingrained in us that it's a kind of attachment to that form of suffering. We identify ourselves as being a victim, and it's difficult to move beyond that feeling. And because of that, because we're stuck in that feeling, it's difficult to heal. We can be attached to negative emotions, such as anger, using its powerful, like adrenaline pumping energy to try to push for social change, right? While also using anger as a self-defense mechanism to protect ourselves, to cover up our vulnerability, our raw woundedness. Because our minds are so full of prejudice and attachment and fear and anger, when we try to create a mind of immeasurable love, we only end up creating immeasurable negativity. So we need to really make sure we fully understand, that we reflect on the four immeasurables over and over and over again, thinking of the meaning of the prayer from different perspectives, really deepening who we include, who we exclude, watching our minds to see how much more work we need to do to fully integrate these teachings into our own actions of body, speech, and mind. So in this third section of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of Western Dharma centers in supporting minorities. And then I've got a few discussion questions. So I'm going to try to wrap up the presentation by 11:30 or so. And then the last half an hour will be open discussion and around some of these discussion questions. So Western Dharma centers, and this is based on the book Awakening by Larry Yang, and his experience in trying to build, his experience actually started out, when he went to different Dharma centers and his feeling of being marginalized, feeling like he just didn't belong, right? So he explains in his book Awakening, why he felt that he didn't belong and why his needs were not being addressed. So that's kind of the background for this. So he talks about how Western Dharma centers tend to think that we shouldn't talk about our differences because the point of our practice is to see our similarities, and the Dharma practice is to transcend the sorrows of this world. So instead, he would argue that seeing the deep nature of our differences and how they're intrinsically part of our lives is really important, right? Because you have to acknowledge the differences in order to then see the similarities of our human experience. We all feel different at some point in our lives. And it's that experience, in that experience of difference is a similarity. So it's just that point that we all share in common is that experience of feeling out of place, right? So just as we can't have a love without, both joys and sorrows, we can't have a life without both differences and similarities. So it's important to recognize, where people are coming from, where we're coming from. He talks about this idea of spiritual bypassing. So it's, and I think this is something that that's true that we tend to do this. So it's to try to, ignore, to try to rise above this sort of messy side of our humanness, to try to push it under the rug and pretend that it doesn't exist. We all have unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So we have to do the hard work of confronting, naming, identifying our individual suffering without trying to just pretend it doesn't exist, right? So kind of talking in a very broad way about, peace, love, and granola, of, unconditional harmony for all sentient beings, yada, 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 right? We need both the absolute aspiration of universality as well as the relative path of our humanity. So we need to pay attention to those aspects of our lives, to our differences, and just don't pretend that they don't exist or ignore them. And I think, if we have a community where there are very few people of color or others experiencing, intolerance coming to our center, then we have to ask ourselves, is that what we want? Is that a good thing? Is there something that we can do to open our doors to be more inviting, more welcoming? And then also, I think, whether it's in the context of being at home, in our outside of the center, right? Or, in the center, how can we talk about difficult issues, like race, like, injustice, without getting into a heated argument, right? It's difficult. It's extremely difficult because, people come from different backgrounds. People have, have different perspectives. It's not easy. But how is it, if we don't talk about these issues, again, isn't that just kind of tacitly supporting the status quo, right? We have to ask ourselves, are we just ignoring, something that's difficult, hoping that it'll go away, right? Well, it's not, right? It's something that in our prayers, we're making these aspirational prayers saying that, I'll do anything for any sentient being, right? And yet, are we really doing are we really educating ourselves? Are we really reaching out and trying to make that connection with people who may need, who we need to support, right? So what are some of the things that, we could do to welcome and encourage diverse communities who may be newly coming to the Dharma, right? And so I think the main idea, a couple of ideas, and again, this is from Larry Yang's books, is to, first of all, to acknowledge that that everyone has this sense of wanting to belong, right? And that feeling of wanting to belong, of having a safe space, comes from being with people who are like you, right? Who have shared common experiences. And so, being able to offer a place where groups can get together to feel safe, from almost providing a safe place from the day-to-day experience of racism or homophobia and other forms of oppression and discrimination. That's what, can we open the center to provide that kind of safety? And then in terms of the role of a teacher or somebody, who's the talking head, right? No, I'm kidding. But anybody, and it's not even just a teacher, it's the conversations, that you have together informally outside of the Gompa, right? The role of all of us is to talk about the Dharma, and in particular, how does that relate to an individual's experience, right? Everybody's coming with different needs and vulnerabilities. Helping, make that connection, I think is really the most important thing, right? So if somebody who's new to the Dharma is sitting and trying to, meditate, maybe for the first time or so, a beginner in meditation might experience, as we all do, fears and anxiety. A lot of stuff comes up when you sit down to meditate, right? Particularly if you're coming from a background of trauma, right? Sitting quietly can be extremely frightening, right? If you think of, memories of past attacks might come up, especially if you're in that relationship of abuse. If you're still in that same relationship, then sitting quietly may be extremely difficult. And so, for a meditation teacher to just tell a student who has come forth, and admitted this type of difficulty and asked for assistance, right? If the meditation teacher's response is, "Oh, just sit with it, it's going to go away," right? Don't worry, just sit with it. You don't have enough experience, just sit with it. That may not be, the most skillful means of addressing that person's feelings, right? So having a little more, being a little bit more discerning, being more, I think it's a question of taking the time to really understand, where somebody who is experiencing that degree of discomfort, where is that person coming from, and how, can you best address him or her? So this idea of creating a safe space is important for all of us, right? It's very, very difficult for us to release our self-defense mechanisms when we've been injured. It really comes, I think, back down to this question of refuge, of understanding refuge, right? We take refuge in the Buddha as the protector, right? So Khenpo Rinpoche talks about refuge all the time because it's so important, right? It's the heart of the path. The Buddha is the protector from all fear and harm, right? Particularly, the fear of death and being reborn in the lower realms. We need to confront all of our fears and suffering instead of just ignoring them, so that we can wholeheartedly go for refuge. Buddha is the teacher. He's the supreme physician. He's always with us, right? Always caring for us. We're always protected, by our refuge vows or bodhisattva vows. We should always think of the Buddha just as a little child always thinks of his or her mother, seeking protection and finding it in the palm of the Buddha's hand. So Larry Yang was he took ordination as a monk in Thailand for a number of years. And he said, whenever we invoke the three refuges, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, we can be sure that the refuges are being invoked by someone else in the world at exactly the same moment. It's because there are always others who are seeking the same sense of spiritual safe haven that we are seeking. The specific refuges that we envision in the Buddhist tradition share in the larger human aspiration for a sense of belonging and protection. The intention and energy behind the refuges to facilitate peace and safety in the world are universal to the human spirit and prevail across all cultures. So everybody, we all need the sense of refuge, right? Especially perhaps people who are different from the dominant culture. So important. And so, the importance of having a safe community to practice is that, as I said earlier, it gives us an opportunity to put down our defenses, to really examine our identities, who we are, and how we're seen. If we're always feeling that, we have to keep this barrier, that we have to protect ourselves with armor and the like, then we'll put all of our energy into protecting ourselves and never have an opportunity to stop and really see what's the actual source, what's really going on. Right? We need to be able to see that we can be attached to a form of suffering that says, I have to look a certain way. I have to conform to what others, expect of me. All of that, has to be examined and allowed to, basically renounced, abandoned, let go of all of that. So we can use mindfulness, right? Once we have the safe space, a safe container, we have the sense of the teachings being, the path to all of that is the context that allows us to use mindfulness to abandon this storytelling, this negative imaging, this internalized self-criticism. Once we can do that, these thoughts will, of course, will still continue to arise because we've been habituated to them for so many years. But we can relate to such thoughts in a more constructive manner, right? We won't allow them to overpower us. We won't buy into them as much as before. If we see our suffering clearly, it will change and transform. But if we don't see the suffering, if we don't acknowledge it, then it will just continue to feed itself, and spiral upward. It becomes an even deeper, more entrenched habit that's harder and harder to overcome. Okay. So this sense of, belonging, of creating a safe space is so, so important. And I think, that's a feeling that we've all, recognized and we're all experiencing now because of COVID, right? So we used to come to DNKL and see our friends and share in that sense of partnership, of community, of building something together, right? And so it's very precious to us, right? And then now, because of COVID, for the past year, we've been meeting online, which is great, and thank goodness, we can continue to do so. We have this opportunity, but it's not quite the same as being together in person, right? And so we can see how that sense of having a safe space to gather is really vital to us. So we're going to do just like a 5-minute, like a mini meditation on this, going back to this idea of feeling safe and belonging, and thinking that it's a feeling that we really value as part of our spiritual practice. So here's the first question. So just, sit comfortably. We'll just do this for 5 minutes. What is the experience of belonging for you? What does it mean to belong? How does it feel in the body? How does it feel in the heart? What allows you to feel safe enough to soften the defenses that can hide or protect you? And finally, how might others who are different from you need to feel that precious sense of belonging in the world in their life? Okay, so I hope that was helpful to have a few minutes of silence to just think about what we've been talking about, particularly the importance of this idea of belonging and refuge. So we still have some time left, and I have these discussion questions that I thought might be good. So I'll read the question, and then you can unmute yourself, and then and then share whatever you would like to share. So the first question is just kind of an overall question. How can we embody the heart teachings of our spiritual tradition? How can we embody the heart teachings of love as expressed as generosity and giving, of ethical behavior and mindful awareness? How can we put these teachings into practice? How can we support each other and our communities in cultivating and developing these elements, right? So how can we embody the teachings, and how can we, reach out, support each other? How can we support our community in developing good behavior, developing love, generosity, and the 6 perfections, right? How can we develop, maintain, and deepen our awareness of different cultural communities? All right, so those are 2 big questions. So we have a message from Karen Salick, where she said that our unconscious biases, I guess, can hurt others when we do them. So when we act out of an unconscious bias, right? This can hurt others. She gives an example of her Black son being harmed on a regular basis. Yeah. No, you can unmute yourself, Janet. How's that? Just unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for this session. This is amazing.
I have, oh, sorry, Karen's still talking. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Janet. I'll say something after.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know, it's such a great class on Tendrol, and you always bring so many wonderful things to our, getting our minds thinking. And I can't help but think that part of this has to include how we respond to the people that we see as doing the injustices, such as who are doing the shooting, or there's so much like willingness to be hateful and angry at them instead of understanding the ignorance that's at the root of their suffering, which is causing them to do that. And I just would love to hear, maybe you said it, I have to confess I've had to multitask a bit during this class, but that to me seems like an important piece that we all need to bring into this equation is we're not going to help by just being angry and hateful at those people.
Right. I mean, the oppressors are just as much, it's very important to develop compassion, to try to probe into where they're coming from as much as for their victims. Yeah, and in fact, I was reading something about how police in general, the suicide rate among police is extremely high. And so the trauma that they experience is something that is very, very tangible, very real, very, very frightening. I mean, here are police officers who, many of them, of course, want to do the right thing, right? They've taken, oaths, the oath of protecting other people, and yet they're put in these awful positions where often they have to make decisions extremely, extremely, quickly, without being able to, without having the luxury, maybe, these are like fight or flight decisions, and they're saddled with the same implicit biases that all of us are. In fact, in the book Biased, there's a very, very long description about going into implicit biases and the like, and she actually, Professor Eberhardt, spent a long time working with the Oakland Police Department, trying to help them overcome the implicit biases against Blacks. Recognizing that, and she, in fact, I'll just say this, quickly. She gave the example of a Black police officer who reached out, to help. It was a Black police officer who was trying to help a young Black woman whose son had been shot, and he was sincerely wanted to help her, and yet the minute the mother saw him, this wall came up and she just turned away, and he was heartbroken. So yeah, that's very much the other half of the story, and I should have mentioned that. Thank you. And you guys should turn on.
Can I add something to that, actually, because I've been working a lot on an anti-racism task force.
Oh, excellent. Who's this?
It's Karen Salick.
Oh, okay.
So I'm actually heading one of the subcommittees for a big anti-racism task force at Andover, and on experience. And I'm actually one of only a handful of white people on the task force. And I think a couple of things could be helpful just to sort of think about. And I've been really looking forward to this session, by the way. So thank you, because I'm trying all the time to think about how to use my practice in this work. But one of the things that we talk about a lot is just sort of thinking about our own whiteness, and sometimes some of the shame that comes around that, and not doing that, actually really understanding that, like, because I think we don't think about just being white, because that's just because we're the dominant culture and that whiteness we don't pay attention to. But as we start to step into this work, there's a lot of discomfort around it that causes pain, and it's difficult. And then you kind of go through that phase of a little bit of, you get a little holier than thou for the people that aren't along the ride with you. And so starting to think about that empathy of your own whiteness, others, sort of where they are on their own path. And actually something that was really helpful to me is thinking about how the Buddha talks about teaching differently for where somebody is. And even in our, even in, you know, one of the things we say daily, which is, you know, in the guru prayer, now I'm just trying to get to the, because it's so far at the end, like I will, you know, bring all beings, you know, like in whatever way is best for them. And so this idea of just not shaming people, kind of helping them and giving them like concrete examples of equity. And one thing I wanted to just share really quickly is, you know, Daniel, his favorite place is Bar Taco in Westport. It's like his favorite restaurant. And about 3 months ago, he wanted it so badly. And I said, okay, well, you have to go pick it up. And this was the first time he had ever gone to do pickup there. But we go and we used to, you know, before COVID, we used to go and eat there. And before he deployed, we did his going away party there. When he came home from his deployment, it was the only place he wanted to be. There were 5 white people in front of him. The woman at the podium asked every single person, what was their name? What was the name on the pickup? When he got there, she looked at him and said, Uber Eats or DoorDash.
Oh my God.
And so it's just those little things. And like, and I called and spoke to her afterwards, and I had to practice so much empathy because she was like, she thought like in her mind, she was doing him a favor to get him out of there quickly.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
She just
Anyway,
didn't even realize it. No, it's an excellent example. Yeah.
Thank you for this class.
Oh, thank you, Karen. Thank you. I'd love to hear more about your work.
Actually, I would love that. So offline. And can you also, in an email to all of us, share some of your books? And I can actually too, if you'd like, if anyone would like, there's a lot of good stuff that we've been with like doing. There's actually an equity, Andover did an Andover equity challenge for like 21 days to just read and learn. So if anyone's interested in some of that, I can share that.
Definitely. Yep. That'd be great. Anybody else? Jennifer?
Hi, Annie. It's Bree. Can I ask a question? I heard you say early on in the talk, or maybe midway through, advising to let go of the thought of I have to be a certain way. And especially that, just using the same terms as you, minority groups, internalize that and to become aware of it and to let it go. However, there's also, this is something that I struggle with because I'm not always, I don't always like appear as, like everybody else as far as like my gender expression. So this is something I struggle with often. So the fact of the matter is that discrimination is real. I have been discriminated against in my work. And so I do carry every day of, when I walk into work, it is, I struggle balancing that. It's down to. So so can you talk a little bit more on that? I mean, the way I understand it, and maybe you can, just comment on this part, is like to have that awareness and to know and like to, well, I guess I could use some feedback on that. I mean, I'm aware of it and I know it. However, my job, I've lost a job due to, surrounding this issue and fighting for social justice for other underserved people. So it is, and you're totally right. It was a traumatizing experience actually for me personally, professionally. I almost quit my profession as a counselor. A lot with that. So, you know, I am still powering on and trying to uplift other youth, but it does, you know, the reality is you look at people in power and they are the ones making decisions. And if you're working up the ranks, you know, you can just be gone like that. So any guidance on that would be awesome.
Well, I think we just have to, you know, continue to be true to ourselves and who we are and what we believe in, and not buy into, you know, what others think they know about us, because most of the time they don't know us. And just not give up, right? You know, people will, like, I cut my hair short. My hair used to be, before I took ordination, my hair was, you know, very, very, very long. And then I cut my hair short. It should be shorter than it is today, but I'm going to go see my mom, so I didn't shave my head. And, you know, people will, you know, walk down this, you know, sometimes it doesn't have that happen that often, but people, you know, especially men, they'll look at me with this, you know, like, I know you. Or sometimes women too, like, I'm like, what? You know, like, excuse me. But anyway, you know, I just kind of try to laugh it off. And I know that probably doesn't, I don't know if that's offensive, but, you know, I try to just make light of a situation and keep going, right? Because, you know, I grew up and people were like, oh, ching chong Chinese, you know, pointy eyes and weird eyes. And when I was young, and it really bothered me, it really hurt. I wanted so badly to have, you know, blue eyes and blonde hair. Well, it wasn't going to happen, right? So, you know, try to sympathize with people who are in the same situation, maybe for different reasons, right? And not give up.
And I love the idea of like being able to laugh upon it or to move past it. And I believe that is possible. Like, you know, with that situation I referenced, that person, I had someone specifically targeting me, and I hold no more anger for them, which is wonderful, but it took a lot of meditation.
That's hard.
In his shoes with his suffering. And I've grown so much, and I'm thankful for it. It's like, I think I learned in one of my classes, I remember somebody mentioning, you know, your worst enemy is your best teacher. And it's completely true. So yeah, there is that part, but I guess it's, I guess, do you have any, I think, you know, for me being in this in a certain way is like, do you recommend any like equanimity practices so that you can get from that point of like feeling like, oh, I'm being targeted, to like just seeing a bigger picture and seeing, because there's always things that you can do. There's never, you know, even if you're being discriminated against by some people higher up, if you're calm and like have that even point of like, you know, state of mind, you can figure out other ways, right? So like, do you recommend any like equanimity practices?
Yeah, same thing for Immeasurables. Trying to really go back and thinking, you know, there people who are targeting us, you know, it's again, it's from their own ignorance, right? It's because they don't know, or because, you know, they want to beat up on somebody else because somebody's beating up on them, right? It could be anything, right? And so not keeping our hearts open and not becoming callous, and not, you know, like you were saying, you know, not just, or somebody was saying, right? Realizing that the people who can be oppressing us are just as much, or if not, are just as equally important in our lives in terms of, you know, being an object of our compassion, and not shutting down, not closing the door to them. Just like you said, they're our best friends, right? Dharma is all about, you know, really working through our tendency to close doors. You know, very small, that's me, right? Teeny tiny compassion. I will keep working on that and it'll come. That's what it's all about. Really important. Kensler Paget has been talking about that, you know, over and over again. Compassion is not just for our friends and families. Really, really important. Anybody else?
Hey, it's Jennifer and Riley.
Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you.
Sorry, Riley was so angry earlier. So reactive earlier. I just want to thank you so much for having the class. I do feel in terms of, you know, creating a safe space, it's important to have these kind of classes and discussions, right? I mean, Reading itself and the surrounding towns don't have a lot of diversity,
Mhm.
but Danbury is the most diverse city in Connecticut, and it's only, one town over.
Mm. Mm.
And because of COVID and things being online, I don't participate that often in it because it's still very late. But there's a Sangha group in the Bay Area that has a people of color, meeting every
Mm.
week, and it's really fascinating to see what the topics are.
Oh.
And it's just, I think it's important in terms of educating myself, and to have more, because there's a lot of history of things that I'm not even, I consider myself fairly educated and fairly up to date on these kind of things, but there are a lot of things that I don't know too, and that's also part
That's a
of
good point. Yeah.
safety, is to be interested in other people's cultures and histories, and to
Exactly.
more and respect it more. I'll just say as an aside thing also, like they had someone talk a couple weeks ago about the Japanese internment, because it was
Mm.
anniversary date for that lately. And he said that the first people who were arrested by the FBI were Japanese American Buddhist priests, because
Mm.
not only were they Japanese, but they were also Buddhists.
Yeah.
They were, right? So they were like doubly un-American.
Oh my gosh.
They were a double
Imagine
threat.
that.
So it was like, wow.
Double threat. That's right. That's right. Oh.
But right, that's what we want to work on. We want to work on whether it's internalized or external.
Yeah.
And as we live in society where these constructs exist, we can't not have them. They're there. So it's
Right.
more
Just ignore them.
on acknowledging that they're there and working to not let them run our thoughts and emotions unconsciously and our
Yeah.
actions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Tendrol, I just wanted to follow up on that just a little bit because, thinking about being non-discriminatory, right? I mean, it automatically induces discrimination, and we have to actually, think through, or at least have some consciousness of differences in order to even think about non-discrimination.
Right.
So, being aware of that, I think, is really important. The other thing I was thinking is that we tend to take our focus, on different groups, that are discriminated against, from kind of the public media, right? So, and there's kind of up and down, and it's women, it's blacks, it's anybody non-white, it's anybody non-male, it's men, it's whatever it is. And I think we also have to be aware of that, because that can be manipulated, and I mean by the culture, and I think it is.
Right.
And the question that you asked about embodying, the heart teaching in a Dharma center. I think, I think that's a great question, because a lot of people who come to Dharma centers are people who have been traumatized, who have suffered abuse, or have hearts that are very much invested in other people's suffering, right? And a lot of the result of that can be people are not kind of integrated into themselves. They don't know how to take care of themselves.
Right.
And so so I just think that we're too much for the let's be really perfect about being non-discriminatory, right? And let's make sure we focus on each and every, and we don't really deal with what's in front of us.
Mhm.
And I think, I mean, I can speak as a male. I think that men have been, vilified, for good reason, for behavior that needs to be vilified. But as a class, and I'm just throwing this out because it's probably unpopular, to say this. And so I think, we as people, men, women, we have to think about these things and not, kind of jump on the bandwagon. So,
Right. So we're just categorizing people, like just going along with what the media is saying without actually really stopping and understanding.
The urge
Categorizing
by
people.
discrimination,
Right.
discriminating, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's true too. Yeah. All sentient beings, not just the ones who are popular. Yeah.
So the question, I mean, how does the Dharma Center do that? I mean, I think the point is that a lot of people don't know they're not even close to the feeling of embodying any sort of, well-being where they can, kind of, easily dissect all this stuff. So, I think, to be aware of that and to also look, because Dharma centers don't do therapy, right? But there is also kind of an attitude amongst people who have studied a lot of Dharma that it can be therapy, that they fix themselves, and I don't think it works that way. I think you get fixed through experience, through your own experience. So
Right.
and I think that in order to be effective in social justice, you have to kind of be together.
Well, I mean, I think the Dharma Center plays a role in terms of providing a safe space to have these conversations, to explore these issues, to make sure that people feel that they can share their experiences, their vulnerabilities, their experiences of trauma, right? And be understood and not be told, okay, go sit in the corner and meditate, right?
No, I agree. I think the principle of equanimity, is allows for that, right? And I'm just saying that in practice, a lot of people have difficulty in integrating, let's say, by that I just feeling comfortable doing that, because they feel as if it's unpopular, or they're saying something that doesn't
offend somebody else, or
yeah, exactly. And
something we need to be aware of as a community, right?
Anyway, I just want to get my hand up.
Thank you. Those are complex issues that we should keep in mind. All right, so I think our time is over. I think it's 12 o'clock or thereabouts. Any last minute thoughts that anybody would like to share before we close? All right. So in closing, oh wait, I had one last closing quote. So I'm sure many of you heard Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem. I really like that poem. So I just picked out just the last few lines because I think that this kind of captures the spirit of what we're trying to doing at a very high level, right? So she wrote, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge. Battered and beautiful, when day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So I think we should, really end on the message of hope. There are many good things going on. There's, really been a proliferation of acts of kindness. We don't hear about it so much, but there's much to be hopeful about. And I could go into some specifics from different aspects of American society and law, but I think I'll skip that for now. But so anyway, I think let's just keep thinking along these lines, think of what, DN and KL as a community, if people are interested, how can we be more inclusive? How can we do more to welcome others in our community? And of greater importance, I think, is, how can we recognize our own implicit biases, our own unconscious biases? How can we embody the teachings and practice them every moment of our lives? Okay, so thank you very much, and be well, and may the Dharma teachings flourish. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ani.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ani Langa.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.